the students early so they could get home before the major blizzard began. It had been kind of a crazy day, and Ellen stayed after school to make sure that every one of her students had been picked up. After the students were gone, Ellen headed to a gas station where she filled up her car and then went home to hang out with Sam. So they hung out for a little while, and then Sam decided he wanted to go work out. And their apartment complex had a gym in it, so he left at 4:45 p.m. After he worked out, he headed home, but right away, something was off. Their apartment door was locked. Now he did have a key to the apartment, but the swing lock was inactive, so he could only open the door a couple inches. So Sam texts Ellen, and he's like, hey, I can't get in. And throughout these texts, you can tell that he starts to get annoyed. These are the texts he sends to Ellen. The first one said, hello, then, quote, open the door, followed by, what are you doing? And then this is where you can tell he's getting mad. He says, I'm getting pissed. Hello, you better have an excuse. What the F? And the last text he sent her said, you have no idea. But even though he's knocking and he's texting his fiancée, Ellen isn't answering and she isn't coming to the door. So Sam becomes concerned and he goes to the building security and asks them to open the door. I guess the security had a policy that they didn't open doors for anyone. So Sam goes back up to the apartment, and then he comes back down several times trying to get them to open the door. And then Sam is left with no choice but to break into his own apartment. And he would later tell police that there was a building security officer kind of supervising this. So Sam breaks the door down, and once he does, he gets a glance of what was on the other side of that door, and his breath suddenly catches in his chest. Ellen was on the other side of the door. She was on the floor of their living room. And right away, Sam knows she's dead. Ellen's body was leaning against a cabinet, and she had a clean towel in her hand. There was blood everywhere, and her body was riddled with stab wounds. Sam immediately calls 911, and the dispatcher instructs him to perform CPR. Sam is in complete shock, and he begins chest compressions before realizing there is a knife lodged in his girlfriend's chest. And at this point, the 911 dispatcher tells him to stop compressions. EMTs arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Ellen was pronounced dead at 6:40 p.m. Right away, police believe that Ellen had chosen to end her life. At the scene, investigators found freshly cut fruit and a colander with freshly washed blueberries also had a stab wound on her stomach and a gash on her right scalp. She had 10 stab wounds to the back of her neck and 11 bruises on her right arm, abdomen, and right leg. Some of these bruises were old and others were fresh. They were all in like varying degrees of healing. The ME ruled the case as a homicide. No one from the police station or the medical examiner's office contacted Ellen's family about the change from initially believing she had chosen to end her life to changing it to homicide. They would find out about that just while watching the evening news. Once the case was ruled a homicide, the Philadelphia Homicide Unit was handed the case. They looked at Sam's key fob records that tracked him around the complex. Detectives were able to clear Sam as being involved because he was at the gym when he said he was. So his alibi checked out, and detectives were able to determine that no unauthorized person had entered the apartment complex during that time that Sam was at the gym. A few days later, on January 29th, the police department announced that even though the medical examiner had ruled the case as a homicide, they believed it was likely that Ellen had ended her own life. As the investigation continued, detectives found that Ellen had really been struggling with her mental health in the weeks leading up to her death. Those closest to Ellen had noticed that she had been very anxious and worried about every little thing. When Ellen was asked about her emotions, she blamed it on her job. Teachers who were co-workers of Ellen's were brought in and interviewed by police, and they said she had seemed extremely stressed out, but not more stressed than any other teacher. Ellen's parents told police that she had called them and told them that she wanted to quit her job and move back in with them alone. And they asked, why she was thinking of kind of, basically throwing everything away. Her relationship, her job. And, she just said she didn't like her job, and she was really stressed out. There were no fingerprints or DNA left inside the apartment from anyone other than Sam and Ellen. Ellen's fingerprints were on the murder weapon, and the swing lock on the door had been engaged from inside the apartment, and there was no other way to leave. They just had that one door. After Ellen's parents were interviewed several times, they made it clear to detectives that she was acting odd, and they actually thought that it was probably just nerves from her upcoming wedding. But I guess Ellen's parents did urge her to see a psychiatrist, and she took their advice. Ellen had 3 visits with her psychiatrist, and it really did seem to improve her mood and her mental stability. In the doctor's notes, he stated that he did not believe Ellen was suicidal. She was diagnosed with an adjustment disorder and anxiety her system. No recreational drugs or other prescriptions were found. Zoloft, which was one of the antidepressants she had been prescribed, has been kind of blamed for her death because one of the side effects is suicidal tendencies. Police uncovered texts and a text exchange between Ellen and her mom, Sandra. She said to her mom that the Klonopin was helping, and her mother said that she was so happy it was. After looking through her phone, they did not find any clues, any texts or searches that led them to believe that she was thinking of harming herself. But still, police are looking at this as a self-harm case, just due to the fact that there is a complete lack of evidence to suggest it was a homicide. There was no forced entry, but a lot of people argued that Ellen could not have stabbed herself in the back of the neck. Research indicates that only 1% of self-harm cases are stabbings. People just don't believe she could have repeatedly stabbed herself. The investigators tried to contact a neuropathologist to determine whether the stab wounds on the back of her neck severed her spinal cord. If the spinal cord had been severed, then it would have rendered Ellen paralyzed before she was able to inflict the stab wound that ended her life. The neuropathologist told police that the spinal cord was hit, but it had only been damaged and not severed, and he predicted this actually would have made Ellen completely numb, so she could have continued stabbing herself without inflicting any pain. With this information, the medical examiner reversed his findings and changed the cause of death from homicide back to suicide. After this, Ellen's parents tried to get their hands on all of the pictures and documents that had to do with her case. They then brought in a forensic pathologist named Cyril West, who's actually known for contesting the single bullet theory in JFK's case. He looked over the reports and said he could not believe that police had ruled this as a suicide. The family really wanted to get things rolling. They wanted police to reopen her case. They wanted justice for their daughter. They hired an attorney and a forensic pathologist, and they were hoping that they would be able to talk police into reopening Ellen's case. But nothing happened. The police denied access to the records, which, of course, angered the Greenberg family. The family wanted every single thing that had to do with their daughter's case, so they had to file a public record request, and they were eventually given access to the records, but they could just go into a room and look at them. They couldn't take notes, they couldn't take pictures, they basically just could look at them and then leave. A retired police veteran named Tom Brennan offered to work on Ellen's case for free. He looked at the files and he said, just because someone doesn't have defensive wounds doesn't automatically mean this was suicide. He had experience with similar cases, and he called what happened to Ellen a blitz attack, which is where the killer comes in so quickly and so forcefully that the victim doesn't really have time prosecutor asked to see the case file, and when he looked at the file, he realized there was no neuropathology report, and so he asked the ME and he asked the police, and they basically said maybe it got lost. Tom Brennan found that the ME had kept a piece of Ellen's spinal cord in the office, so he got in touch with a neuropathologist and asked him to come examine this piece of her spinal cord. This doctor concluded that one of the stab wounds had penetrated Ellen's cranial cavity and severed the cranial nerves and brain. So basically, he's saying as a result of this, Ellen would have been impaired and probably unconscious. This forensic pathologist also concluded there was evidence that Ellen had been strangled. A man named Henry Lee would join the team investigating Ellen's death. He reviewed Ellen's case and said that the number and types of wounds and the bloodstain patterns were inconsistent with self-harm and were consistent with homicide. Tom also showed that there were tons of videos on YouTube showing how you could manipulate swing locks from the outside of doors, so it wouldn't have been hard for someone to leave and then activate the swing lock, making it look like she had locked the door. Another study was brought up, and this study showed that suicides that involved stab wounds were all like underclothes, not over the tops of clothes, like Ellen's were. And the police had said to the public that Ellen's phone and computer were free of any red flags. Other professionals, however, said that she had searched quick suicide and painless suicide using her laptop. In 2019, the family filed a civil suit against the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office and the pathologist. They were hoping to get the ME to change the ruling from suicide to homicide. To this day, lawyers and other people on the team agree that this situation was impossible. One expert determined that two different kinds of knives had been used. One was serrated and one was smooth, but only one knife was found in the apartment. Sam, Ellen's fiance, has never done any interviews. In 2020, there was some information about Sam that was released about how he acted and some inconsistencies in his stories. So Sam always insisted that he kicked the door down while the security guard was with him. But the security guard on duty that day, Phil, said he was not with Sam when he kicked the door down. Phil also told police that Sam was not wearing sneakers. He was wearing boots that day, which is weird because he was coming from the gym. Sam also had called 2 numbers before he dialed 911, so he breaks the door down. He's wearing boots, which would probably, I don't know, I've never kicked a door down, but probably help kick a door down with boots, not tennis shoes, which you would normally wear to the gym. He sees his fiancée dead. He calls his parents. Then he calls his uncle, who is a lawyer. And then he calls 911. The dispatcher said that when she asked Sam inconsistencies with the story. This led people to believe he was involved. Something I really don't understand about this case is how police are saying there was no sign of forced entry when there had to have been, because Sam kicked open the door. That's a sign of forced entry. People who really do not believe that Ellen did this to herself point out that the swing lock could have been manipulated from the outside. The killer could have also worn gloves, which is why his fingerprints wouldn't have been on the knife. But if Ellen was, like, cutting up fruit right before it happened, her fingerprints would have been on the knife. They say that the fact that there was almost no blood spatter indicates that someone had cleaned up the scene. But because police had failed to do that luminol test, no one will ever know. Another major inconsistency with Sam's story is about Ellen's body position. He told police that when he arrived, she was propped up against the kitchen cabinets. But there was a dried blood, like a trail of dried blood, found on Ellen, running horizontally down her cheek from her nose to her left ear. This dried bloodstain leaves only three possibilities. A. Ellen stabbed herself and then moved her own body. B. Someone else killed Ellen and moved her body. Or C. The bloodstream was able to defy gravity. If Ellen moved her own body, it just doesn't make sense. Yes, if she had done this to herself, she could have moved her body. But if her body was in a way that the blood had dried running that way, and then she moved her body, that doesn't make sense. So here is one of the more prominent theories. I mean, basically, either she did it or she didn't. And then those who believe she didn't are kind of split. Most people believe Sam did this to her, and other people believe it was someone else. The reason most people believe it was Sam is because of those bruises on her body. They were all in various stages of healing, and this seems to point to the fact that Ellen may have been a victim of domestic violence. Her intense anxiety and behavioral changes could also further indicate she was a victim of domestic violence. Sometimes, a lot of times, victims of domestic violence don't share what they're going through because they still really love the person who's doing this to them, and they still care about them, and they don't want to share these details of their lives with others. So, this is why people believe that Sam killed Ellen. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest this, just a theory. Sam Goldberg now lives in New York City with his wife and 2 children. He has never been arrested or charged in connection with Ellen's death. Josh and Sandra Greenberg are still fighting to get justice for their daughter. And this is the story of Ellen Greenberg. Tell me what you guys think. Do you think Ellen did this? Or do you think she was a victim? I 100% do not believe that Ellen did this. Can you imagine trying to stab yourself in the back of the neck? I'm not saying it's impossible, but fiance found stabbed 20 times, did not search online for suicide by Lee Egan, and Philadelphia.cbslocal.com had an article by Matt Petrillo titled, "A Family Says New Evidence Suggests Ellen Greenberg, woman found stabbed 20 times, was murdered." Thank you guys so much for joining me. I'll be back